Okay, thanks very much for that very warm introduction. How are we all feeling today? I said, how are we all feeling today? Come on, let's go, let's go, let's go. I'm very excited to be here, especially with this particular group, and especially at this particular point in time in human history. And that's because we are in a moment of profound change. There are several new technologies that are all basically emerging at the exact same time. We've had moments in history where there's been new technology revolutions. You know, we had the steam engine, there was electrification, the invention of the radio, and today we're in this moment where there seems like there's at least a half a dozen, all kind of hitting their stride at the exact same moment in time. The one that's clearly captured people's imagination and opened up wallets and has caused, I think, a real furor in the world of business is AI. And AI as a technology is profound. AI has the potential to change how we think about really what computers can do, from devices that can process information to devices that can perform tasks, who can think and reason through problems, and maybe even feel emotions at some point in time. But there are other new technologies emerging as well. Transformations in how we generate and store energy, transformations in technologies in our bodies, and how we interact with the physical world. But there's one technology in particular that I think is going to have a greater impact than any other. And it's the technology behind crypto, of course, and it's known as blockchain. Not exactly the most sonorous word, it doesn't really roll off the tongue, but blockchain technology is the foundational economic layer for this new era that we're entering into. It is, in no small ways, really the second era or the second evolution of the internet. So this is a topic that I've been covering for a very long time. In 2016, I co-authored a book called Blockchain Revolution, which tried to explain to a mainstream business audience, to an investor audience, why there was more to the story than Bitcoin, why this technology was ushering in this new internet of value, why a digital medium for money could also be applied to stocks and bonds, titles and deeds, and other assets in the economy. This book, by the way, was written at a time when the entire market cap of crypto was like $15 billion, right? Smaller than GameStop's market cap at its peak. I mean, if crypto was a public company in 2016, it probably would not have cracked the S&P 500. It would have been considered like a small cap stock. So we got a couple things right. I followed it up a couple years ago with a book called Web3, which talked about how this technology was expanding beyond the world of money and finance into business more generally, culture, and society. So the thesis is pretty simple. For many decades, we've had the internet, the web, the internet we know and love. The internet, though it's had a really profound impact on how we consume content, how we interact with each other, how we participate in social networks, it's fundamentally an information medium. So when you use the web to, send and move information, you're not sending an original thing, you're sending a copy. So if you send an email to one person, you can send it to someone else. If you post something, in Reddit, everybody can read it. If you enter something into Wikipedia, it's available for all to see. And for most kinds of information, that's actually a really good thing. But when it comes to things that have value, things like money, stocks and bonds, really anything that we can invest in, being able to create copies is not such a great idea. So instead of sending someone an email, let's say you're sending them $50. It's important that they know when they receive it that it's the only version of its kind, that you can't send the same $50 to another person. As if, you can send an email to one person, you can send it to another person. Because if you can copy money the way you can copy information, the money becomes worthless. I mean, think about it. Imagine you bought a share of Apple, and then the seller could sell the same share to 1 million other people, the same way you can send an email to 1 million people. So it's great to have a printing press for information. The digital printing press of the web changed the world in the same way that the printing press of the Gutenberg days changed the world. But it's not so great to have a printing press for money. Well, maybe it's okay. And when the money printer goes burr, we all benefit. But for individuals, it's important that we have a way to create scarcity in assets, right? And this is the double spend problem that Satoshi so brilliantly solved, and it's the thing that kicked off the blockchain revolution that allows us to know when you buy and sell ETH, when you participate in the NFT marketplaces, when you do anything in crypto, that you have the only version of its kind, that someone hasn't duplicated those assets, because we have this trusted, decentralized network. So blockchains are helping to usher in a new internet of value. And I think, like the first era of the internet, there's going to be winners. It's not like this is some big decentralized kumbaya and there's no way to make money in this industry. There are going to be a handful of champions that emerge. So the first era of the internet had its own champions. They're known as the Magnificent Seven, or MAG7. Who's heard of this term before? I'm guessing pretty much everybody, right, in this room? MAG7? I hope so, because these companies together are worth, more than the entire GDP of China or Europe, right? Like, we're talking tens of trillions of dollars. And each of these companies became extremely valuable by capturing the upside, or really kind of dominating the key industry verticals of the first era of the internet, right? So for online retail, we had Amazon. Amazon is known as the everything store. It's a place where you can buy anything, stuff. But it's also a platform that allows retailers to sell their goods to the Amazon community, to the Amazon customer base. More than half of what Amazon sells actually doesn't come from Amazon. It comes from third-party sellers who are drop shipping to customers. So Amazon has dominated e-commerce on the web, $2 trillion market cap. Online media, Netflix. Google also shares this crown, but they've dominated a whole other category, which I'll get to in a second. Netflix is basically killed the movie business, for better or for worse. It is the platform where almost everybody goes to watch content. It has completely changed TV, film, and every other form of visual media. Search. You used to use the yellow pages. Looking around the room, I see a couple people who may know what I'm talking about. There used to be other ways to find information, and the cost of search was very high. Google dropped the cost of search to zero. Google today has 3 different products that each have more than 1 billion users. This kind of thing would have been unfathomable years ago. Compute, NVIDIA. There are other, challengers to the throne, but 90% of all data center spend for GPUs still comes to NVIDIA. They are the computing platform for the first era of the internet. Just go through a couple of these quickly. Enterprise, Microsoft switched from to a SaaS model, and today they're the dominant player in the enterprise. The mobile web, Apple, though more people use Android devices, Apple generates more revenue, more profit than all of its competitors combined. And the social web, Facebook dominated social media. Of course, Twitter, Reddit, and all these others have their communities too, but nothing really rivals the big boy in the room. So how big are these companies? Really big, really big, really, 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 really big, right? So most of them are bigger than the entire stock markets of other global stock exchanges, other countries. I'm Canadian, I'm from Toronto. The Toronto Stock Exchange has had an amazing 2-year run. We have lots of gold miners and oil companies and all these companies that have done really well as this devaluation trade kind of gathers steam. You take every single public company in Canada, Shopify, Barrick Gold, RBC, Lululemon, all these Canadian companies, add them all up, and it's smaller than individual market caps of like 5 other companies, right? That's how big we're talking about. So this is the value that was created from the first era of the internet. And today the MAG7 are about 1/3 of the entire S&P 500, but have contributed more than 2/3 of all the gains in the index over the last several years. So what comes next? Maybe these leaders of the old paradigm will come to dominate the next era. Certainly, I think a lot of investors are betting on Google and maybe on Facebook being able to transition to an AI age, to be able to transition to a digital economy based on blockchain. And we've seen how in some ways they are benefiting. But my view is a little bit different. I think that there's going to be a new set of winners, a new set of champions that is going to emerge. The only constant in capitalism is change. The creative destruction of the market ensures that new companies are constantly emerging, challenging the dogma of the old. I mean, just look at computing. Back in the 1960s, there were a handful of companies that were known as the Seven Sisters. They made mainframe computers. Do people even know what a mainframe computer is? Anyway, mainframes gave way to mini computers, which gave way to PCs. And in the 80s, everyone thought IBM was going to dominate the PC era in the same way it dominated the mini computer in the mainframe era. But then this thing called software came along, and it turns out all the value was captured not by providers of computer equipment, but by those who made software that ran on those machines. And today, IBM's still around, HP still around, Texas Instruments, these companies are not irrelevant, but they are not the companies that came to dominate the next era that came along. So we're entering a new era. So do we really think that the companies that dominated for 30 years are going to dominate the next era? I think that's an important question to consider. And I may be wrong, but I think we're going to see something new. So the winners of the Internet of Information were centralized platforms that dominated the Internet of Information. They were platforms where data was not owned or controlled by users. They were platforms that could change the rules at a moment's notice. They were platforms where the interests of users didn't always align with those of the company. Maybe we would like a social network where there isn't as much advertising as we see on Instagram. Maybe we would like a social network where communities that form, that self-organize on platforms like Reddit actually get to control and govern their fate and their destiny and their likeness. Maybe there's something different. So maybe the Internet of Value will have its own winners. Not the MAG7 of the old era of the Internet, the Magnificent Seven, but something different. Call it the DAG7, the Digital Asset Group of 7. The leaders of this new era won't be companies, they will be protocols. They won't be centralized, they will be decentralized. And they will put more power, I believe, into the hands of users who are going to be their owners. So the DAG7 is a concept that we've actually trademarked at CMCC Global Capital Markets. My firm, CMCC Global, one of the longest running VC investors in the crypto space. We started in 2016 in Hong Kong with modest beginnings, raised $1 million, probably the hardest $1 million that we ever raised. But today, run over $500 million, spread across different business units, digital asset funds, private early stage venture capital into companies, fund-to-funds business, and a capital markets business focused on launching vehicles on the public markets. The DAG7 are going to be the leaders of the new Internet of Value. And by the way, the industry verticals for the Internet of Value will differ from the industry verticals of the first era of the Internet. If we're going to have a truly digital economy, then we're going to need a way to express value, to store value. And that's where Bitcoin, I think, has firmly emerged as this digital gold. Notwithstanding the fact that gold is doing well at a moment that Bitcoin is not, over the long term, since Bitcoin's inception, Bitcoin has done extremely well on a relative basis. We're going to need an open application ecosystem, not a closed application ecosystem like the Apple Store or Android, but something where anyone, anywhere, from the lowliest vibe coder to the largest institutions in the world, can launch applications and assets and can experiment. Ethereum has clearly emerged as this platform. There's an old expression that nobody ever gets fired for hiring IBM, right? Back in the old days, if you were like a CIO of a big enterprise, you could take a risk by going with some new upstart, or you could just hire IBM. You're probably overpaying. They probably won't do that great a job, but your job is not at risk. I think there's a little bit to this with Ethereum. Fidelity yesterday just announced a stablecoin. Fidelity being one of the largest asset managers in the world, over I think $10 trillion of AUM. They are interestingly, the CEO, Abigail Johnson, she's part of like a family of founders, investors who built this business. She's been mining Bitcoin in her office since 2014, right? Probably longer than many of you have been in crypto, longer even than I've been in crypto. So this is a company that comes by it honestly. But where did they start? They launched the stablecoin on Ethereum. Why? Solana is supposed to be faster, more performant, better suited to Wall Street and to high-speed trading and so forth. And that's actually all true. Like on a technological level, Solana has many, many benefits. But Ethereum has staying power. It has the ecosystem It has, still to this day, more than half of all the total value in DeFi. It has more than half the stablecoin values. It has more than half of the RWAs, real-world assets, that have been brought on chain. So, if you're going to start anywhere, start with Ethereum. What will happen ultimately is Fidelity will go multi-chain like every other company has, PayPal, MasterCard, Visa. They do implementations on many, many different blockchains. But right now, Ethereum is the place where you start, right? And that is incredibly powerful. And today, interestingly, Bitcoin and Ethereum are almost the size of MAG7 stocks as it is. Bitcoin about $1.5 trillion, Ethereum around half a billion dollars. So I think these are firmly established. It gets a little bit more interesting as we go down this list. So I do think that there will be a need for internet capital markets, for a blockchain that is highly geared towards the high-frequency demands of Wall Street. The Solana network can handle more transaction volume than fixed income, so bonds, equities, stocks, and foreign exchange, currencies combined in any given day. That doesn't mean that's what the network is doing today. It just means that it has the capacity. It's like a massive pipe that right now just has a dribble of water, but it can handle a huge torrent if needed. And if you look at the growth rate of RWAs and stablecoins and adoption, the growth rate is higher on Solana than it is on Ethereum, right? But I still see this multi-chain world. On-chain in the enterprise. Do we really think that most public companies and big institutions are going to build only on these open public networks? Or are they going to want to do their own thing, right? Be masters of their own fate? And I'm not talking about these consortia blockchains that used to exist in the old days that didn't really do anything. They were just sort of like window dressing for most big companies. I'm talking about building customized versions on top of public networks. So this is what we call on-chain in the enterprise. And there's a couple of really, really interesting platforms that are suited to this. And this is maybe getting a little too down the long tail of crypto, but platforms like Canton, Avalanche, Hedera, these are platforms that count as some of their founding members, many of the biggest corporations in the planet. So we see that there's an opportunity for blockchains to carve out these niches, right? In the same way that each of the Internet of Information's core industry verticals had their own winners. And I think this is really important, and it speaks to a philosophical point of view, which is that, unfortunately, most of the crypto assets out there will become worthless, or worth less than they are today. But we're not going to end up in some world where Bitcoin rules them all or Ethereum rules them all. In the same way that the power law applied to the Internet of Information and applies to lots of other things. There's 5 or 6 car makers. There were only a few railroads by the end of the consolidation in that industry. There were only a few mini computer makers. There were only a few big internet companies. There's only going to be a few blockchain platforms that capture most of the value. I'm not saying everything else doesn't have any value. It just means that this is where the value will accrue asymmetrically. And it's possible that a lot of things fail. And honestly, that's not the worst thing. I'm reading this amazing book, and I just came across this fantastic statistic last night, which is that in the last quarter of the 19th century, half of all the railroads in the US went bankrupt. Like half. Right? This would be like if half the MAG7 went bankrupt in the next 25 years, right? And the reason was that they were in this cutthroat competition. They were over-levering themselves. They were constantly spending on CapEx, building. And eventually there were many financial crises, and these things went under. But what was left behind was 250,000 miles of railroad track that completely transformed the economy. And I think we're seeing something similar happening with the emergence of these new technologies like blockchain and like AI. So, that worked. That never works. So, who's going to participate in all of this? Well, the history of finance is kind of the history of market access, of democratization. In the 19th century, most people didn't buy stocks. The stock market was a club of ultra-rich speculators, and there were, there were days on the market. I think the worst day in the New York Stock Exchange, 32 shares traded. Not 32 companies, 32 shares of all companies combined, right? So that's the way stock markets began, sort of humble beginnings. But with time, they became more open. So in the 1910s, 1920s, we got the introduction of things like mutual funds. Later on, the introduction of discount brokerages, right? So all of a sudden, the cost to buy a stock was $10 or $20 versus $100 or $200. We got decimalization from fractions to decimals. We had stock splits, which made it easier to access markets. We had ETFs, which allowed investors to get exposure to strategies and indices without needing to buy individual assets. And then more recently, like zero-fee trading, where maybe this is the Web 2 model. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product, and they're selling that data to big market makers. But you can now buy and sell securities for free. So this is a really profound change, and it's something that is translated into the data. So today, 45% of all the transaction volume and all of the equities held directly or indirectly in the market are held by households. It says households and nonprofits, but nonprofits are kind of a small part of that. This is pretty wild, right? So like half of all of the stocks on the US stock market are held by individual households. But there's a big gap between what the power that people have and the power that they think they have. I think that retail still thinks of itself as kind of like the underdog in a way. And they are, to be sure, right? But they have enormous power that's untapped. By the way, do you know what percentage of institutions vote in corporate matters? About 75%. That's crazy in its own right. It should be 100. Like, why wouldn't you vote whenever there's a proxy? For retail, it's under 20%. So most of the time, I'm sure you guys notice this. Your brokerage, they send you a notice, hey, there's some corporate matter, here's a 300-page document, ignore. But I think with AI, it's going to be much easier to synthesize this information and make it easier for individuals to vote their shares. So I'm thinking the next evolution of Wall Street bets should be called Wall Street votes. Because once you've got the shares, you can actually put them to work. So who's participating in this revolution? Now, this is for crypto, but there's a lot of concern, the MAG7, the S&P 500, this is just boomers and older investors who are getting rich. Well, that's not true with equities, but it's especially not true when it comes to crypto. And there seems to be a bit of a male bias here. But as you can see, the vast majority of crypto asset investors are on the younger side. And crypto is, I think, the only asset, I think, in history that I'm aware of, where most of the value that was captured from the appreciation of these assets was captured by retail investors and not institutions. Most big institutions dismissed this until it was a lot larger. So fortunes were made by those who were in the weeds, had conviction, and put their money where their mouths were. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the MAG7 takes over the DAG7. Maybe the blockchain revolution gets co-opted by big tech companies. But the history of commerce and business says something a little bit different. So this is a guy named Clay Christensen who wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. I'm sure some of you have read this book or maybe at least heard the basic idea that leaders of the old paradigm often have a hard time embracing the new. They are hamstrung by corporate culture, by legacy values. Oftentimes, they've got a business that's so good, it's paying them so well that they don't want to kill the golden goose, even though they don't realize they're all standing on a burning platform, where the risk of jumping, of doing something different, is actually less than staying put. But Clay Christensen also said this, which is that markets that do not exist cannot be analyzed. Not only is the market opportunity unknowable, or unknown at the time that the technology comes along, it's unknowable. I think this is really interesting. When you think about AI and blockchain and these new technologies, What do people talk about? AI will reduce headcount because it'll make it easier to program new applications and do call centers that use bots instead of people. Blockchains will make it much easier to do transactions because it reduces the settlement time from T+3 to T+0 and allows you to move money around the world instantly. These are all true statements, to be sure. But oftentimes, the impact of a technology is way weirder than we can possibly predict. A lot of people thought that the internet was going to be this publishing medium for information, right? Because that's what the first era of the Web 1 was. It was a static platform that allowed you to display information. So who was this going to go after? Well, classifieds, newspapers, magazines, those would be disrupted. And they were. But a lot of people in the early days of the web probably didn't expect or anticipate the rise of social media, for example. That was something that was internet native. So there's going to be a lot of innovation that's sort of blockchain native, AI native, that we haven't yet predicted. Where is this all going to happen? Who is going to win? Silicon Valley was once known as a tech Galapagos because of the unique combination of talent, capital, universities, corporate R&D labs that created this critical mass of excitement and know-how that led to the first era of the internet giants, right? But this time is very different. We are not talking about a single local location. We're talking about a global archipelago, an archipelago that spans the world and spans the country. Silicon Valley is not the crypto capital of the world. It may not even be the crypto capital of the United States of America. We may be in it right now, or maybe there is no capital, right? The technology has become diffused as access has become greater and as markets have become more democratized. That is the new world that we are stepping into. So I'll end with a parable about the invention of chess. And it goes something like this. The king of the land, and some people say this is from ancient China, others attribute it to Spain. It doesn't really matter. The king of the land, the emperor, he is presented this new game by someone in his court. And he is so enamored with chess that he offers its creator anything he wants as a reward. This is such a wonderful game. Thank you for introducing us to it. And the creator, who's obviously very bright because he invented chess, says, I'm a humble man. I ask only for some rice to feed my family. But I want you to give it to me in the following way. 1 grain on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains on the second piece of the chessboard, 4 grains on the third piece of the chessboard, and so on. And the king, not a math guy, obviously, says, hey, sure, whatever, your wish is my command. A humble request from a humble servant. Of course, 4 becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, becomes 128, becomes 56, and so on and so forth. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire kingdom can produce in a year. And by the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet Earth in 6 feet of rice. The story ends, by the way, with the king getting very upset and chopping this guy's heads off, which that's not the moral of the story. The story is a discussion about exponential growth. Moore's law increased the amount of computing power we can put on a chip by millions of fold and ushered in the first era of the internet, right? The world today is as different from the world 50 years ago, as any 50-year period in human history. That was the first half of the chessboard. We are now staring down the second half of the chessboard. The second half of the chessboard where AI, where blockchain, where all these new technologies are not just emerging but are converging at the same time. And it's happening at a moment when individual investors, when people have more agency over how they spend their time, where they put their money than at any point in history. So I think that the next half of the chessboard will belong to all of you. Thank you very much.